The wind that night was sharp enough to cut through the thickest coat. The city was quiet, except for the sound of tires hissing over wet pavement and the soft hum of streetlights fighting the darkness. It was one of those nights when even the air felt heavy, and people hurried home without looking up. At the edge of a quiet street, a woman stood waiting at a bus stop. Her hands were buried deep inside the pockets of a faded coat that had lost most of its warmth long ago. The hospital tag still hung from her neck, swinging slightly every time the wind blew. She had just finished a long shift, 12 hours, maybe more. Her back ached. Her legs felt like they would give up any minute, but she didn't have enough left in her to care. She only wanted to go home. But the bus was late. It was always late. Her shoes were soaked through from slush on the road, and her fingers felt numb. Every few minutes she rubbed them together, hoping to bring back some warmth. Her breath made small white clouds in front of her face, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. She tried to move a little, stamping her feet, but it didn't help. She looked down the empty road again. No headlights. Just darkness. A car passed by, a sleek black one that belonged to the kind of people who didn't wait for buses. Its tires splashed water as it moved past, and she stepped back quickly, but a few drops still hit her shoes. She sighed, shaking her head. Inside that car sat a man who was used to quiet, expensive rides and warm air conditioning. He sat in the back seat looking out the window without really seeing anything. His day had been long too, but in a very different way. Meetings, decisions, numbers, and faces that smiled when he entered a room but forgot him as soon as he left. He was the kind of man people described as successful. He owned companies, made headlines, and had everything money could buy, and yet he couldn't remember the last time he felt peace. His driver slowed down at a red light near the bus stop. The man glanced out and saw her, just a quick look at first. A woman standing alone in the cold, hugging herself tightly. He noticed the hospital badge, the tiredness in her face, the way her body trembled as she tried to stay warm. He looked away. It wasn't his problem. The light would turn green and he'd go home to warmth and silence. But something about her stayed in his mind. Maybe it was the way she didn't complain, didn't try to wave down a car or call anyone. She just stood there quietly as if waiting was all she had left to do. The light turned green. "Sir?" the driver asked softly, ready to move. "Wait," the man said. The driver paused, unsure what to do. The man leaned forward slightly. "Pull over," he said finally. The driver did as told, parking the car a few feet ahead of the bus stop. The man stared out the window again. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then he opened the door and stepped out. The cold hit him instantly, sharp and real. It had been years since he'd felt it this way. Outside his heated world of offices and cars. He walked slowly toward the bus stop, his shoes crunching over the thin layer of ice. The woman looked up, startled. She hadn't heard the car stop, and for a moment she thought something was wrong. The man stopped a few steps away from her. "You'll freeze out here," he said quietly. His voice was calm, deep, and carried a sense of certainty that made her blink in surprise. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though she clearly wasn't. He looked at her, her lips pale, her fingers trembling. "No, you're not," he replied. She frowned. "I'm waiting for the bus. It should be here soon." He glanced down the road. There was nothing but darkness and fog. "When was the last time it came on time?" he asked. She didn't answer. He already knew. He took a slow breath and said, "You're coming with me." Her eyes widened. "Excuse me?" He didn't move closer, didn't raise his voice. "It's freezing," he said simply. "You need to get warm." "My car's right there." She shook her head. "I can't just get into a stranger's car." "That's fair," he said. "But standing here will make you sick." She looked at the car, sleek, expensive, quiet. The driver inside didn't look threatening. She looked back at the man. His expression wasn't harsh, just steady. She could tell he was used to giving instructions that people followed. But there was also something else there, a hint of concern. "I'm not going far," he said. "There's a shelter near here. You can warm up and wait until your bus comes." She hesitated. Everything about the situation felt unreal. But her body was shaking so hard now that her teeth almost chattered. She thought of her small apartment, the broken heater, the long walk from the bus stop once she got there. She thought of her next shift in the morning. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said. "Come on." She looked down, then nodded slowly. "All right," he opened the car door for her. The warmth hit her the moment she stepped inside. She sank into the seat, wrapping her arms around herself. The driver passed her a small blanket from the back seat. She thanked him quietly and pulled it close. The man got in beside her, closing the door. The city lights flickered through the window as they drove. For a while, no one spoke. The hum of the engine and the sound of rain against the glass filled the silence. Finally, the man asked, "You're a nurse?" She nodded. "Yes, I just finished my shift." "Long night?" he asked. She smiled weakly. "They're all long lately. We're short-staffed, and I covered for someone who called in sick." He studied her face. She looked exhausted, but her eyes had a quiet strength in them. "You must like what you do," he said. "I do," she answered. "Even when it's hard, people need someone there, especially the ones who don't have anyone else." He nodded slowly, looking out the window again. Her words lingered in his mind longer than he expected. After a few minutes, the car stopped in front of a building. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and well lit. A sign near the entrance read, "Community Shelter and Care Center." She turned to him, confused. You know this place?" He nodded. "I helped fund it years ago," he said quietly. "But I've never actually been inside." They stepped out of the car. A wave of warm air met them as the shelter doors opened. Inside, a few volunteers looked up in surprise. They greeted him politely, not expecting to see him there in person. "She's cold," he said simply. "Can you get her something warm?" One of the volunteers nodded quickly and led her toward a small room with blankets and hot tea. She turned back once and met his eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. He gave a small nod. "You're welcome." For a moment he stood there, unsure what to do next. He had meant to drop her off and leave, but something made him stay. He walked inside, looking around the place he had helped create but never visited. The walls were lined with coats and blankets. People were sitting quietly, some reading, others just resting. He felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt, maybe, or realization. He had built this shelter for his company's charity program, but until now it had been nothing more than another project to him. Now it looked real, human. The nurse returned a few minutes later, holding a cup of tea. Her cheeks had color again. She smiled at him, and for the first time that night it reached her eyes. "This place is wonderful," she said. "Thank you for bringing me here." He nodded. "I'm glad you're warm now." "You didn't have to stop," she said. "Most people wouldn't have." He looked at her for a moment before replying. "Maybe most people should." She smiled again, quiet and thoughtful. The warmth of the shelter seemed to soften everything. The air, the noise, even the man who usually lived behind a wall of meetings and phone calls. When it was time for him to leave, he told her to rest there for a while. She promised she would. As he stepped back into the cold night, he looked up at the empty bus stop across the street. For some reason, it didn't look as lonely as before. The car door closed behind him, and they drove off slowly. But his eyes stayed fixed on the reflection of the shelter lights fading in the distance. He didn't know why this small act felt so heavy, so personal. All he knew was that he couldn't stop thinking about that woman at the bus stop, how easily she could have been overlooked, how close she was to being forgotten by a city too busy to care. He leaned back in his seat, lost in thought. For the first time in a very long while, his world of glass towers and quiet boardrooms felt distant. That cold night had shown him something no business deal ever could, a glimpse of what it meant to simply be human. And though he didn't know it yet, that single moment, that choice to stop, would change both of their lives in ways neither could imagine. The next morning came slowly. With the pale light of dawn creeping through the narrow windows of the shelter, the nurse woke up to the sound of quiet voices and the smell of coffee. She stretched her sore arms, still feeling the fatigue from the long shift the day before, but for the first time in a while she wasn't shivering. The blanket covering her was warm, and someone had left a small tray beside her, tea, a sandwich, and a note that simply said, "Take care of yourself." She looked at the note for a moment, her mind going back to the man from last night. Everything had happened so fast, like a dream she wasn't sure she'd really lived. She still remembered the way he'd said, "You're coming with me," not as an order, but as if he couldn't stand the thought of her being left out there in the cold. After finishing her tea, she thanked the volunteers and promised to come back someday to help. She stepped out of the shelter, the cold air biting her cheeks, but this time it didn't feel as cruel. Something about the night before had changed her. A small reminder that kindness still existed, even when it came from unexpected places. Across town, the CEO sat in his office early that same morning. The city was still quiet, most employees not yet at work. He stared at the screen in front of him, but the words on the report didn't seem to make sense. His mind kept returning to that woman at the bus stop, the nurse who'd refused to complain even when she could barely stand from exhaustion. He had seen hundreds of faces in his life, in meetings and at events, but none had stayed with him like hers did. Something about her calm endurance had unsettled him. For a man who'd built his world on control, that feeling was unfamiliar. His assistant knocked on the door, holding a folder. "Your meeting with the board is in an hour, sir." He nodded. "I'll be there." She hesitated, then asked, "Are you feeling all right? You seem quiet today." "I'm fine," he said shortly. But the truth was, he wasn't sure what he was feeling. He turned his chair toward the window, looking at the skyline. The city stretched endlessly, full of people with their own struggles, people he never thought much about. Until last night. When the meeting started, his team presented numbers, projections, and ideas. They talked about profit margins and market trends, things that usually interested him. But today he felt distant. When one of the managers mentioned cutting funds for the charity programs his company sponsored, including the shelter, something inside him snapped into focus. "No," he said firmly, interrupting the discussion. The room went silent. "We're not cutting that program," he continued. "In fact, I want to review every project we fund. I want to see them myself." The others exchanged glances. It wasn't like him to get personally involved, but there was a tone in his voice that made no one argue. When the meeting ended, he stood by the window again. The city below seemed different now, less like a collection of buildings, more like a place filled with people he had never really seen before. That evening, when work was done, he asked his driver to take him back to the shelter. The driver glanced at him in surprise but said nothing. When they arrived, he stepped out quietly, hands in his coat pockets. Inside, the same warm light greeted him. The volunteers recognized him immediately, standing up straight in surprise. "Sir, we didn't expect to see you again," one of them said. "I just wanted to check in," he replied. "How are things here?" They gave him a quick rundown: food supplies, donations, repairs that were needed. He listened carefully, nodding, asking questions. It was the first time any of them had seen him so genuinely interested. As he spoke with them, he noticed movement at the far end of the room. The nurse had returned, wearing her hospital uniform again, hair tied back neatly. She was speaking softly to an older woman, helping her with a cup of tea. He didn't interrupt, just watched for a moment. She seemed different here, calm, at ease, in her element. When she finally looked up and noticed him, she smiled in surprise. "You're here again." "I said I'd make sure you got somewhere warm," he replied. "Wanted to check if it's still warm enough." She laughed quietly. "It's more than enough. I came back to help for a few hours before my next shift." He nodded, impressed. "You work long hours and you still come here?" She shrugged. "I used to think I didn't have much to give, but last night reminded me, sometimes showing up is enough." He didn't know what to say to that. Those simple words carried more truth than most speeches he'd heard in boardrooms. They sat for a while on a nearby bench, watching people come and go. The shelter was busier than before, and the volunteers moved with quiet purpose. "You know," she said softly, "I didn't expect someone like you to stop last night." He glanced at her. "Someone like me?" "Someone who doesn't need to," she said. "You could have just driven past." He looked away, thinking, maybe I've driven past too many times already. She didn't press for details, but something about the way he said it made her realize that maybe he wasn't as unshakable as he looked. There was a kind of loneliness in his eyes, not the kind that came from being alone, but from being surrounded by the wrong kind of people for too long. After a few moments, she asked, "What made you stop?" He hesitated before answering. "I don't know. Maybe it was the look on your face. You weren't asking for help, but you needed it." She smiled faintly. "Sometimes people need help but don't know how to ask." He nodded. "And sometimes people forget how to see it." For a moment, they both sat in silence, listening to the soft murmur of voices around them. It wasn't awkward, just peaceful. Before leaving, he spoke with the shelter manager, offering additional support for supplies and repairs. The volunteers were grateful, but more than that, they were surprised to see him genuinely care. When he finally left, the nurse walked him to the door. "Thank you again," she said. "Not just for last night, for this place." He looked at her and smiled, a rare, real smile. "You should thank yourself. You're the one keeping it alive." She shook her head. "No, we all do what we can. You did too. You just didn't know it." As he stepped outside into the crisp air, he felt lighter than he had in years. The next few days passed quickly, but something had changed in both of them. For her, it was a renewed sense of hope, that the world still had people willing to care. For him, it was the beginning of a quiet shift, a slow awakening to a life he'd been too busy to notice. He started visiting the shelter more often, not as a donor, but as someone who wanted to understand. Sometimes he'd arrive after work, still in his suit, and help serve meals. Other times he'd sit with the residents and listen to their stories, something he'd never done before. The nurse saw him there several times. Each time she greeted him with that same calm smile, and each time he felt the walls around him soften just a little more. One night, while they were both helping fold blankets, he asked her, "Why did you choose this job?" "It must be exhausting." She looked down at the blanket in her hands. "Because I know what it's like to need someone. My mother was sick for years before she passed. Nurses were the only people who stayed by her side when I couldn't. I promised myself I'd be that kind of person someday." He listened quietly. "And you kept that promise." She smiled faintly. "I try." He thought about that long after she left that night. In his world, promises were often broken. Contracts, deals, words that meant little. But here, surrounded by people who had so little, he saw more honesty than in any meeting he'd ever attended. The days grew colder again as the season deepened. The nights stretched longer. But neither of them looked at the city the same way anymore. She no longer felt invisible walking home from work, and he no longer looked away from the people standing at bus stops or sitting on benches in the cold. Something about that one encounter had opened a part of both of them. A quiet connection built not from wealth or need, but from understanding. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew that night at the bus stop had changed the course of their lives. The days kept moving quietly after that night, but something had changed for both of them. The nurse had started visiting the shelter more often, sometimes before her hospital shift and sometimes after. It became a place that reminded her of warmth, not just from the heaters and blankets, but from people who still believed in helping each other even when life was hard. For the man, the change was more complicated. He still wore his suits, still ran meetings, still made decisions that shaped companies, but he no longer left his compassion at the door. He had started noticing things that used to escape him. A tired security guard at the office gate, a cleaner staying late, the anxious faces of employees who never spoke in meetings. Sometimes, while sitting in his office, his mind would wander back to that freezing night and the quiet voice of the nurse saying, "Sometimes people need help but don't know how to ask." One afternoon, while reviewing reports, his phone buzzed with a message from the shelter manager. They needed help fixing a broken heater in one of the dorm rooms. Without thinking twice, he got up, put on his coat, and told his driver they were going there. When he arrived, the familiar warmth of the shelter greeted him again. Volunteers moved around carrying boxes, and the smell of soup filled the air. The nurse was there too, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a few kids helping them draw pictures. When she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that was both surprised and glad. "You're here again," she said, standing up. "I heard there was a problem with the heater," he replied. "Thought I'd take a look," she laughed lightly. "You fix heaters now?" "I'm learning," he said, and for the first time in a long time there was humor in his tone. They walked together to the back room where a few volunteers were trying to repair the heater. He didn't know much about tools, but he helped where he could, carrying things, asking questions, and even joking a little. It was strange for him. This man who was used to people standing when he entered a room was now holding a wrench and laughing at his own mistakes. When the heater finally started working again, everyone clapped. It wasn't a big achievement in the world he came from, but here it meant warmth for 20 people through another cold night, and that felt real. Later, he sat with the nurse in the small dining area as she poured him a cup of tea. "You're different here," she said quietly. "Different?" he asked. "You smile more. You don't look like the man who runs a company." He looked at the cup for a moment before replying, "Maybe that man isn't who I really am anymore." She tilted her head slightly. "Maybe you just forgot who you were for a while." That line stayed with him. Maybe she was right. Somewhere between all the success and pressure, he had lost the part of himself that could feel simple things: kindness, warmth, connection. They spent the evening talking, not about business or work, but about life. She told him stories from the hospital, about the patients who made her laugh and the ones who made her cry. He listened quietly, not interrupting, just letting her words fill the space. Then she asked, "Why did you start this shelter?" He thought for a moment before answering. "It started as a project, something to improve the company's image. But my mother used to volunteer at a place like this when I was young. She always said helping others isn't charity, it's duty. I guess I forgot that until recently." The nurse nodded. "She sounds like a good woman." "She was," he said softly. "She believed that kindness doesn't need to be grand to matter." For a few seconds there was silence between them, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. When he got up to leave, she walked him to the door. The wind outside was cold again, brushing past their faces. "Will you come back?" she asked. He looked at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "You think I can stay away?" She smiled too. "I don't think so." The following week he visited again, then again after that. It became part of his routine, not because he felt obligated, but because he wanted to be there. He'd bring supplies and food, blankets, or books, but what mattered more was his presence. The volunteers grew comfortable around him. They no longer saw a powerful businessman. They saw someone willing to listen, someone who cared. One evening, he arrived to find the nurse sitting outside on the shelter steps. She looked tired, her hair slightly undone, a cup of tea in her hands. He sat beside her without a word. "Long day?" he asked. She nodded. "Lost a patient today, a young man. I thought I'd be used to it by now, but you never really are." He didn't try to comfort her with empty words. Instead, he said quietly, "I'm sorry." She took a deep breath and said, "It's strange, you know. You spend hours fighting for someone's life, and when they're gone, the world just keeps moving. The buses still run, the city still shines. Sometimes I wonder if people realize how fragile everything is." He looked up at the night sky. Maybe they don't want to think about it. Maybe it's easier not to. She turned to him and said softly, "But you stopped that night. You didn't look away." He met her gaze and replied, "Maybe I was tired of pretending not to see." The words hung between them for a long time. They didn't speak again after that, but something unspoken passed, a quiet understanding that didn't need explanation. Weeks went by, and winter began to fade, but their friendship grew stronger. They found comfort in small conversations, a shared laugh, a story about someone at the shelter, a moment of silence after a long day. It wasn't romantic. It was human. It was two people who had been living in different worlds, learning that kindness could bridge the distance. One afternoon, he brought a group of his employees to the shelter to volunteer. At first, they were awkward, unsure how to behave outside their suits and offices. But as the day went on, laughter filled the room. The nurse watched from the corner, her heart full. She saw how much he had changed. The once distant, cold man now carried boxes, talked to people, and even helped serve food. When the day ended, she walked up to him and said, "You're turning this place around." He shook his head. "No, this place is turning me around." That night, as they were closing up, she noticed him standing near the window, looking out at the city. "You know," she said, "when I first saw you at that bus stop, I thought you were someone who'd never understand people like me." He turned toward her. "And now?" She smiled gently. "Now I think you understand better than most." He didn't respond, but his expression said everything. Before leaving, he turned back to her and said, "Thank you." She looked surprised. "For what?" "For reminding me what matters." The door closed behind him, and she stood there for a while, smiling softly to herself. As weeks passed, their lives continued. She still worked long shifts at the hospital, and he still ran his business. But now their worlds often crossed. He began funding small medical projects at the shelter, arranging free checkups for the residents. She helped organize the medical side, and together they built something meaningful, a bridge between compassion and action. One night, as they stood outside the shelter watching the snow fall again, he said quietly, "Do you believe in coincidences?" She looked at him curiously. "I'm not sure why." He smiled faintly. "Because sometimes I think that night wasn't one." She thought for a moment and said, "Maybe it wasn't. Maybe we were just meant to stop for each other." The air around them was cold, but neither of them felt it. There was warmth in the space between them, the kind that didn't need words, the kind that reminded both of them how one small act could change everything. He looked at her one last time before heading toward his car. "Get some rest," he said. "You've done enough saving for today." She smiled and replied, "So have you." As the car drove away, she watched the taillights disappear into the snowy distance. A strange calm filled her heart. For years, she had carried her kindness like a quiet duty, something she gave to others without expecting anything back. But now she realized, sometimes kindness circles back in unexpected ways. And for him, that night at the bus stop had been more than just an act of compassion. It had become a turning point, the start of rediscovering his own humanity. Neither of them said it out loud, but both knew the same truth, that the world could still surprise you when you least expected it, sometimes in the form of a stranger, standing alone in the cold. The days that followed moved quietly, yet something had changed deep inside both of them. The nurse had gone back to her regular hospital shifts, though now she carried a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. The warmth she had received that night didn't just save her from the cold. It reminded her that there were still kind people left in the world. The man, on the other hand, found himself unable to stop thinking about that night. He had met thousands of people through his work, partners, investors, employees, but none had left him feeling the way she did. It wasn't attraction or curiosity alone. It was more like he had seen a part of life he had long forgotten, a side that didn't revolve around success, numbers, or meetings. He tried to brush it off at first, telling himself he had done his duty by helping someone in need. But the thought lingered in the back of his mind every time he passed the same street or saw someone waiting alone in the cold. He even asked his driver about the shelter, wanting to know how things were going there. The driver told him that the nurse had stopped by again to thank the staff for their kindness. That simple piece of information made him smile in a way he hadn't in a long time. A few days later, he decided to visit the shelter again. He told his assistant it was for a donation follow-up, though in truth he wanted to see how it felt to return. When he arrived, the volunteers looked surprised but happy. He wasn't the kind of man who showed up without an appointment. As he stepped inside, the smell of warm soup and old wood filled the air. People were talking softly at the tables. Children laughed in one corner, and a few older folks were watching a small television near the wall. It was far from luxurious, but it was filled with something his penthouse and office never had: life. And then he saw her again. She was wearing simple clothes, her hair tied back, and she looked much more rested than before. She was helping an elderly man find his medication list. For a moment he just watched quietly, noticing how gentle her voice was and how everyone seemed to trust her. When she turned and saw him, her expression shifted from surprise to a warm smile. "I didn't expect to see you here again," she said, walking over. "I could say the same," he replied, a little awkwardly. "I came to check on how things are going with the place and maybe to see if you were doing all right." She laughed softly. "I'm good. Better than that night, at least. The shelter has been helping me more than I expected." He nodded, not sure how to express what he wanted to say. They talked for a while about her work, her hospital, and how she had been volunteering at the shelter during her days off. He listened carefully, truly paying attention to every word. It was strange for him. He was used to conversations filled with deals and deadlines, not stories about patience and kindness. Before leaving, he made a small donation to help the shelter expand its medical aid section. But that visit stayed with him, so he returned again the following week. And again after that. Soon it became part of his routine. He began helping in small ways, arranging new blankets, organizing food supplies, and talking to the people who came in for help. It was uncomfortable at first. He wasn't used to being around people who spoke so openly about their struggles. But the nurse encouraged him gently, reminding him that listening was sometimes more important than fixing everything. "You don't always need to have a solution," she told him one day. "Sometimes just showing up means more than you think." Her words stuck with him. He realized that most of his life had been about solving problems. Business problems, money problems, strategy problems. But in this place there was no strategy. There was only heart. As weeks passed, the two of them began to understand each other on a quiet level. They came from completely different worlds, hers filled with care and service, his filled with control and structure. But somewhere in the middle, they met. One afternoon, while helping unload donated supplies, he saw her talking to a small group of teenagers. They were volunteers too, and she was teaching them how to check basic health signs. She looked confident and calm, and he realized she was far more than just someone who had needed help one night. She was strong, independent, and kind, the kind of person who gave hope to others without even realizing it. When she caught him watching, she smiled. "You look like you've never carried a box in your life," she teased, noticing how he struggled with the heavy packages. He laughed, shaking his head. "You're not wrong. My office doesn't require much lifting." "Well," she said with a grin, "you're learning now." That moment of lightness stayed with him. He hadn't laughed like that in months. Over time, their talks grew more personal. She shared small pieces of her past, her mother's passing, the struggles of balancing work and grief, and how nursing became her way of giving back. In return, he spoke about his long days, his lonely office dinners, and the emptiness that often came with success. "People think having everything means being happy," he said one night while they sat outside the shelter, watching the streetlights flicker. "But it doesn't. Sometimes it just makes you forget what happiness really feels like." She looked at him quietly for a moment, then said, "Maybe happiness isn't something we find. Maybe it's something we share." He didn't answer right away, but he knew she was right. In the weeks that followed, the CEO began spending less time at high-profile events and more time at the shelter. His assistants noticed the change. He smiled more, argued less, and seemed genuinely lighter. Rumors started in his company about a mystery nurse he was spending time with, but he didn't care. For the first time, what people thought didn't matter. He even began involving his company in community work, funding projects that helped healthcare workers and underprivileged families. The nurse often guided him on where that help was needed most. One evening, as they closed the shelter together after a long day, he turned to her and said, "You know, I used to think I was helping others by donating money, but now I realize I was just trying to make myself feel useful." She smiled gently. "It's not about how much you give. It's about how much you care when you give." That night, when he went home, he couldn't sleep. He looked around his quiet apartment, the expensive furniture, the glass walls, the art on the walls, and realized how little of it mattered. He thought about the shelter, the laughter, the noise, the warmth. That was what real life sounded like. He began bringing small comforts from his office, blankets, books, even leftover snacks to the shelter. Every time he visited, he felt more at peace. It wasn't about the act anymore. It was about connection. The nurse noticed the change in him too. His voice had softened, his eyes didn't look as tired, and he smiled more easily. One afternoon, she told him, "You've changed a lot since that night." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Maybe I just finally started seeing things clearly." They both knew something had shifted between them, though neither tried to name it. It wasn't romance, not exactly. It was something quieter, something built on understanding and gratitude. People at the shelter often assumed they had been friends for years because of the way they spoke to each other, the natural ease between them. In truth, it had only been a few months, but it felt much longer. Sometimes he'd stay late just to help her close up, even though his driver waited outside. Other times she'd bring him coffee at the hospital when he came to drop off supplies. Their worlds had slowly started blending together, not through force, but through care. And while he had always been the one used to giving orders, he found comfort in following her lead in this new world of kindness. It taught him humility in the most beautiful way. There were moments when he caught himself wondering what his life might have looked like if he had met someone like her earlier. But he didn't dwell on it. He was grateful for now, for the chance to learn, to listen, to give meaning to his days. The city was cold again by the time winter started creeping back, but it didn't feel as harsh anymore. The shelter had more supplies, more volunteers, and more warmth than before, and in the middle of it all, two people who had met by chance were quietly changing each other's lives without realizing it. They didn't need to say it out loud, but both knew they were not just helping others now. They were helping themselves heal from the quiet loneliness they had both carried for too long. And that simple truth made every small act, every shared smile, and every cold night spent helping others feel worth it. The season slowly changed again, and soon the harsh winter faded into a gentle spring. The city that once felt gray and frozen now bloomed with colors and soft air. Trees along the sidewalks began to show small green leaves, and the streets that were once covered in snow now carried the quiet hum of morning life. For the nurse, life had started to find its balance. She was still working at the hospital, but she had also become one of the most active volunteers at the shelter. The people there had grown to admire her. She wasn't loud or showy, but she had a way of making everyone feel calm and seen. Whenever someone came in lost or afraid, she would be the first to sit beside them, listening more than she spoke. Sometimes she thought about that cold night, the one that had changed everything. She still remembered standing at that bus stop, freezing and tired, and then hearing that voice telling her, "You're coming with me." It had sounded strange at the time, almost too firm, but looking back now, she realized it was the beginning of a different chapter in her life. The man had also changed in ways he never expected. He still ran his company, but the long hours and endless meetings no longer consumed him. His office no longer felt like a cage. He had started delegating more, trusting his team, and spending his evenings at the shelter instead of behind glass walls and bright screens. He didn't talk much about it to others. People wouldn't have understood anyway. But deep down, he knew that helping others had given him something he couldn't buy with all his money: peace. On most evenings, he and the nurse worked side by side at the shelter. Sometimes they didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The quiet between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. There was respect there, gratitude, and something even softer, something that didn't need a name. One evening, as the two of them were cleaning up after a busy day, the man looked around the shelter and smiled. "You know," he said, "when I first came here, I thought I was doing something good for other people. But I think I was really trying to fix something in myself." She looked up at him and said softly, "Maybe it's both. Sometimes helping others is the only way to heal ourselves." He nodded, thinking about her words. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't met that night?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Maybe we still would have crossed paths somehow. Life has a strange way of bringing people together when they need each other." He didn't reply, but he knew she was right. The next few months passed quietly. The shelter expanded with the new funds he had donated. There were now proper beds, better food, and even a small medical room where the nurse and a few volunteers treated people who couldn't afford hospital care. It had become a safe place for dozens of people, and both of them felt proud of what it had become. But it wasn't just about the shelter anymore. It was about the small changes that rippled beyond its walls. Some of the people they had helped found jobs. A few families reunited. A few lives that once seemed broken began to find their footing again. Every time someone came back to say thank you, the man felt something warm in his chest. He didn't feel powerful like he used to when closing a business deal. He felt human. One day, after finishing her shift, the nurse found him sitting outside near the same bus stop where they had first met. The night air was cool and the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement. He was just sitting there quietly, looking lost in thought. "You found this spot again," she said with a small smile as she approached. He turned toward her, smiling too. "I drive past it sometimes. Thought I'd stop today. It's strange." "This is where everything changed." She sat beside him. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The sounds of distant traffic filled the silence. "I remember that night," she said softly. "I was so tired I could barely stand. And then this expensive car stopped, and I thought, who would ever stop for someone like me?" He chuckled quietly, and I remember thinking, who stands out here alone in this cold? "I guess we both didn't expect what came next." She nodded, her voice gentle. "Maybe it was meant to happen that way. Maybe we both needed saving that night, just in different ways." The wind picked up slightly, brushing her hair across her face. He reached into his coat and handed her a scarf he had brought along, the same one she had left behind months ago at the shelter. "You kept it?" she asked, surprised. He smiled. "I told you I'd return it someday." She took it, holding it for a moment. "I guess this means I have no reason to come looking for it anymore," she said teasingly. He looked at her for a long second before replying softly, "You can still come by the shelter." "You don't need a reason," she smiled, her eyes warm and kind. "You don't either." For a while, they just sat there watching people walk by. The world around them kept moving, but in that moment, everything felt still. He thought about how much his life had changed, how a single act of kindness had led to so much meaning. He had learned that compassion wasn't a grand gesture. It was in the small things, the shared meal, the warm blanket, the gentle word. The nurse stood up after a while, looking down the street where her bus would soon arrive. "You know," she said quietly, "that night you told me you're coming with me. I thought you were just being kind. But now I think we were both meant to walk the same road, at least for a while." He stood up too, his hands in his pockets. "You changed my life," he said simply. She smiled. "And you reminded me that kindness still exists." The bus pulled up, its doors opening with a soft hiss. She looked at him once more, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "Take care of yourself," she said. "I will," he replied. "And thank you for everything." As she stepped onto the bus, he stayed on the sidewalk, watching until it disappeared down the street. Then he turned and began walking back toward the shelter. The night didn't feel empty anymore. In the weeks that followed, he continued his visits, still helping, still learning. The nurse returned too whenever she could, balancing her work and her volunteer hours. They didn't always see each other every day, but when they did, it always felt natural, as if no time had passed at all. There was no grand ending, no dramatic farewell. Life simply continued. But it was brighter now, fuller and softer. The man was no longer the cold, distant businessman people once whispered about. He laughed more. He listened more. He started new charity programs across the city, each one inspired by the simple act of helping one freezing nurse that winter night. The nurse, too, found peace in her days. She still worked long hours, but her heart was lighter. She knew now that one person's kindness could ripple far beyond what they ever imagined. And every year, when winter returned, they both remembered that night. The snow, the wind, the bus stop, and the words that had started it all. "You're coming with me." Those words had once meant rescue. Now they meant connection. They meant life's way of reminding two strangers that sometimes fate doesn't arrive with noise or drama. Sometimes it comes quietly, in a small moment of compassion that changes everything. The story of that night spread over time. The shelter workers often told it to newcomers, a reminder that kindness could come from anywhere, even from someone you'd never expect. And every time the man or the nurse overheard it being told, they just smiled at each other, saying nothing. Some stories didn't need to be retold by the ones who lived them. They only needed to be remembered, and so they carried on, not as heroes, not as saviors, but as two ordinary people who had found extraordinary hope in the middle of a cold winter night.